So today it is my special pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dina Gilio-Whitaker. I first met Dina when we were both writing about history for a large informational website. I was writing about women's history and Dina was writing about Native American history, both adding to the usual stories that we usually learn in school. We've kept up since that time via the internet. Her first book, co-authored with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, was All the Real Indians Died Off, and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. When reading that book in 2016, I again realized how many myths about history I had internalized, even though I thought I was paying attention. In 2019, Dina published her latest book, there it is, As Long as the Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice, From Colonization to Standing Rock. She's here today to help us understand what, as people interested in environmental justice, we can learn from the Indigenous community. After she speaks, she's going to take some questions. So please hold them until she's done. Keep yourself on mute during this part. And we will take those questions after she speaks via chat, which is currently closed. So be prepared to type your questions in at the end. So Dina, we're listening.
Thank you, Joan. Or we say in our language, Lenlemt, Y Peace Nuxil Ku Isquis Dina Gilio-Whitaker. I'm coming to you, I just greeted you in my ancestral language, which is known as Insukchin. I'm a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes, the Sinaixt Band. Which is in what is currently known as Washington State, where my mother was born and raised. And but I was born and raised in Southern California in sort of a diaspora situation. And right now I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Ahashiman people in what's currently known as San Clemente in Orange County. So I'm in Southern California. And let's see, so what Joan, how much time do I have?
I have to look quick.
11:40.
Until about 12:10, our time, so 10 after.
I better make it quick then. Okay, so I'm gonna speed through, let me share my screen. I've got it.
And if you go a little longer, it just is a little less time for questions, that's all.
Yeah, I got it. Okay, I'll try to be brief then. I've got my PowerPoint lined up here and, oops. Let's see. Okay, come on. There we go. Okay, so as Joan said, I wrote this book called As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. This work began as a result of my graduate work in college, began as a master's thesis, and eventually became this book. And I won't spend too much time talking about that, but this is the artwork for the cover, which was done by a very good friend of mine who is a well-known actor and artist named Michael Horse. And I just love the work that he did, and it turned out to be a beautiful book cover. In the book, I talk about environmental justice in a way that casts it through the lens of indigenous knowledge and settler colonialism. And I argue that an indigenized view of environmental justice really changes the landscape, changes the arguments. It doesn't jibe in the same way that talking about environmental justice does for other EJ communities like Black populations and ethnic minorities, because it doesn't cast a wide enough net for the historical foundations and our relationship as Native people with the US state. And that's because, you know, environmental justice focuses on a racialized framework. It reinscribes race as that which determines environmental injustice. And that for Native people, that's only part of the story. It's not the entire story, because it doesn't encompass the relationship of invasion of European invasions into our lands, and then the subsequent genocide and land theft. So environmental justice doesn't talk about that. And it needs to, and then it also does not, the focus on race and racism doesn't take into consideration the fact that as Native people, we are not racial, we're not race groups, we are political groups as nations with the political relationship to the state. So that's this political difference that needs to be factored into environmental justice, but is typically not. So that's the main argument of the book. And so we need to talk about settler colonialism as the framework or the foundation upon which we understand or need to understand what environmental injustice looks like. And settler colonialism is really, another way of saying manifest destiny. And we all are familiar with that term, and as that which the US is really shaped around. And in this narrative of manifest destiny, indigenous nations are constructed as inferior. It is the taking of the land. It begins not as a racial project, but it begins as a religious project based on religious and cultural inferiority. And that's what gets inscribed into the law, like the actual legal structure that maintains this relationship of hegemony or paternalism between us and the United States government. And maintains it to this day, and in this very controlling, relationship that goes beyond consent, and was something that was not consented to in our history of treaty making. Treaty making itself is the recognition of the mutual sovereignty of each parties to the treaties. So this is it was a legal fiction that constructs this relationship that began as religious supremacy, ultimately not racial. And so looking through this lens, and overcoming, like sidestepping or transcending the racial binary, or what we sometimes call the black-white binary, that solidifies race as that determining lens of injustice in the United States. It really looks like not so much racial privilege or white privilege, although it's part of it, but it's really more about settler privilege. Like, what are the benefits that incur through the occupying of indigenous lands that happened through genocide and land theft because of religious supremacy. So these are the arguments I'm making, and I'm writing a new book, and I'm getting more in depth into these arguments in the new book by decentering race as the analytic lens that we look through when we talk about privilege in this country. Thank God we have this language that we talk about now, but it still needs to be more refined when it comes to understanding the US as a settler colonial state, not just the racial state. Okay, so in the relationship or the lens of settler colonialism and manifest destiny, what happens with that history is that manifest destiny, of course, we know is the religious justification for the violent uh, uh, Western expansion of European populations across the continent, and making those lands into the United States, even breaking its own laws and its own treaties to do that. And so this, what became the sort of benign term Western expansion and industrial revolution that sort of drives that genocidal project of violent land theft is our narratives about progress, right? We're all familiar with these languages about America, the progressive state, coming across and taming the landscape, where we know all these terms. We're so familiar with the taming of the West. You know, it's really the conquering of nature is what's happening, and also the conquering of peoples, but it's in the language of modernity and progress. And they're ultimately narratives of life giving for settler populations while they are causing profound death to indigenous populations. And these are, so looking at this as environmental histories, these are histories that connect the genocide, both cultural and physical, of indigenous peoples to the killing of environments, like the destruction of land, and as settlers are remaking land for their progress and their modernity. And we call this term ecocide. So it's the combining of the term genocide and ecosystem. And so, you know, we call this the killing of ecosystems, and genocide combined with the genocide of people as ecocide. And ecocide always goes hand in hand with genocide. And some of the examples are, there's examples given here in these images. And I use 3 images here. On the left is an image of the Missouri River watershed in what is today North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and surrounding states. This is the home of Standing Rock, the Lakota people. This is the context, the historical context under which the Standing Rock conflict occurred, with the making of dams, the building of dams in the 1940s under the Pick-Sloan Act. And the building of dams were about flood control and about water storage to create irrigation in order to feed settler populations, and turning the grasslands of the prairies into farmable, arable land for farming. And so what happens through the creation of 5 dams is that it further disrupts Lakota people from their connection to the land by drowning villages, by drowning food sources, by drowning medicine resources, and displacing thousands of native peoples from their homeland, from which they're still recovering. It's this a trauma that, you know, just another trauma that gets inflicted on the people there. Another example of ecocidal projects in this middle image here comes from my homeland, where my ancestors are from, in the Columbia River watershed, in what's today Washington State, or Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and British Columbia. It happens in a slightly different way. It's not so much as it was in the Dakotas. The ecocide was not so much from forcibly removing people from lands, although that's part of it, but it's more that the building of over 60 dams on the watershed there in various tributaries and the main stem leads to the collapse, the near collapse and ongoing collapse of salmon populations. And salmon for the Columbia River people is like buffalo was to the Plains people. It's the center of our cultures. It's our identities. It's who we know ourselves to be, and our relationship to the salmon as that which provides food and the sacred relationship to the earth, in water and all beings related. So in these particular ecosystems. So this is this is catastrophic for us. We're still trying to figure out how to restore salmon in the river so that we can store our relationship to the salmon. Another very widely known example of ecocide in this third image here represents really the entire Western United States, but in particular the Four Corners region, where you see, this is about mining, the processes of toxic uranium mining that has led to the deaths of thousands of people in the Navajo Nation and other Pueblo communities through the ongoing mining of uranium for the nuclear weapons industry and the nuclear energy industry, that's left thousands of abandoned mines that are still open, basically open sores and wounds on the land, and continue to contaminate and toxify the lands and the bodies of people in these areas. And it's always Native people who are the most, the most disproportionately impacted by these processes, this contamination. This is, again, this is something that that environmental justice, as we understand it in law and policy, doesn't have the ability to really comprehend or do something about, because it's not a broad enough net. Okay, so what happens in these processes, going back to a couple of slides when I talked about the way that the U.S. has constructed Native people as inferior, is a way to legitimize the taking of land through understanding them as being savage and being uncivilized and in need of civilization, which, you know, legitimizes and ratifies the imposing of religious systems and culture in all kinds of ways, so that we will ultimately uh, disappear into the body politic of the US. We will no longer exist. And that's another thing to point out with settler colonialism, is the goal of settler colonialism is always about the elimination of Native people. And it does this in all kinds of insidious ways and unseen ways that play out in narratives that we're all familiar with, but don't connect to it as an ongoing genocidal process. So it is white supremacy and settler supremacy sort of married together, and it becomes woven into the environmental movement in the early days of the conservation and preservation movement, going back as early as Henry David Thoreau and certainly John Muir, who lived during times of profound indigenous dispossession and erasure. Neither one of these guys, and I write about this in the book, neither one of those guys had a conception about that or fought against it, even though Thoreau is known to have been very much, you know, or he perceived himself as a friend to the Indian. You know, he had these friends, these Penobscot friends, and he wrote a whole book about it in the Maine woods. He fetishized Native people, and yet at the same time, ultimately, he believed in their demise because they were not Christians and they were not civilized. So he was ultimately a social Darwinist and believed that they were destined to fade away. And so this is how this white supremacy gets encoded into the preservation and conservation movement. And Muir, of course, actively worked towards the expulsion of Native people in Yosemite Valley, and you know, was famous for his disgust of California Indians. And so all of this stuff gets sort of baked into, you know, first wave, we call conservation and preservation first wave environmentalism. That gets baked into that, and it carries through the 20th century into the second wave environmental movement of the 1960s and 1970s. And part of that white supremacy is inscribed by cultural appropriation, you know, through the back to the land movement. So the back to the land movement, you know, changes, like the 60s bring with it this sort of new civil rights sensibility with it, a rejection of the Christian conservative values of their ancestors, of their, you know, the previous generation. And so this youth movement, you know, is really trying to do better, to be better. They're understanding the environmental issues that are now coming to define American society. And they look to the Indians in this new way to to understand what sustainability or what an environmentally sensible world looks like. And it happens in all these, kind of crazy ways. And it actually gives birth to the New Age movement through cultural appropriation of indigeneity and in and that get in, we see this image down here of the teepee. This was something that was one, kind of symbol of the appropriation of Native culture that tries to get wedded to this settler colonial sensibility, and it doesn't work. And it gets all twisted up, and pretty soon we have a New Age movement that is built on cultural appropriation of Native people and other cultures as well. Um, and so part of that is connected to this concept that we call epistemicide. And epistemicide talks about, it refers to the killing of epistemologies. And that term, epistemology, is just a fancy sort of academic way of saying systems of knowledge. So part of settler colonialism and the genocidal project of the US state was about killing indigenous knowledge. So, the killing of indigenous peoples is, and especially through language, the killing of languages by making native languages illegal and certainly immoral, especially in the boarding school system. This is about the project to kill indigenous knowledges, and those are the knowledges that made Native societies ultimately sustainable over millennia. And this is about Native knowledges about about land practices, which I'm going to get to in this next slide. So, so these knowledges, these epistemologies, indigenous epistemologies, are based on long-term tenure on land within particular ecosystems. We call this, there's a wide range of indigenous knowledges, and one type of indigenous knowledge is called traditional ecological knowledge. And this ecological knowledge is the foundation that Native people built their sustainable cultures on for thousands of years through long-term observation and interaction with these particular ecosystems. So it's always place-based, it's always place-specific, which means that we can say that we need to say that there is not one monolithic, overall indigenous knowledge. There's not. There are common threads, but because these knowledges are always specific to place, there are multiple kinds of knowledges based on particular land practices. So, so this is these knowledges, this traditional ecological knowledge, is not just theoretical. This is not flowery, soft, romanticized indigenous wisdom and folklore and mythology. This is about knowledge that has also been called science, native science. This is applied knowledge that that people used on the land to build sustainable societies. And I'm going to give you an example right now of what that applied knowledge looks like on the ground.
This forest is about to go up in flames. Don't worry, it's intentional. We're here in Roslyn, Washington at a prescribed burn, and it's actually supposed to make the forest more resistant to fires because these woods have been really unhealthy. Think of a prescribed burn as a vaccination against really, really bad fires. And just like giving out shots, you need people who know what they're doing.
This is like the main tool of prescribed fire. You get a little bit of a arm workout.
Oh, yes. Today, prescribed burning is showing up more and more in state forest management policies. Why? Because wildfires are way worse than they used to be. A century of poor forest management and fire suppression has created a lot of fuel to burn. All that underbrush acts like kindling. Climate change leads to hotter temperatures and longer dry periods, which create perfect conditions for a wildfire to start. Put all that together and you have the makings of a disaster. Today's wildfires can even take out big old growth trees that have historically been able to stand up to wildfire. Take this piece of ponderosa pine that's been around for over 2 centuries. This cross-section of a tree trunk is about to teach us a bunch of history, so show some respect and pay attention. Before European settlers arrived, Native American tribes in the Western US were already forest management experts. Many Native peoples embraced fire as part of certain ecosystems. In fact, many trees in the West, like ponderosa pines and giant sequoias, are made healthier by regular human-managed fire. The Yakama Nation used prescribed burning to keep the forests healthy and to cultivate different resources they depended on, like berry plants. But when colonists showed up, it didn't occur to them that the forests were so impressive and the timber so strong because they'd been taken care of by humans.
I mean, there were very colorful responses. In some instances, they're just burning things up. They would also notice these abundant berry fields, and they wouldn't always make the connection.
In 1910, there was a massive wildfire that spread across Montana, Idaho, and Washington. As a result, the federal government was like, we've got to take better care of these forests. Time for a Forest Service. Up until that point, there had been some debate over prescribed burning. But the new agency imposed a hard and fast fire suppression policy. No burning, no exceptions. Traditional burning was outlawed, and tribal members were punished for practicing it. And it turns out that was not the best way to keep forests healthy. It was also really culturally oppressive.
Preventing fires was another way of directly reducing native influence within their ancestral territories.
And forests that had been managed by humans for thousands of years were suddenly growing wild and unchecked. So that's basically how we end up here, in a period of time that's warmer than ever before in recorded history, with a whole lot of very unruly forests. Around the 1970s, some ecologists started to point out that suppressing fire in forests was actually making wildfire damage worse. And that way of thinking has gotten more and more traction.
2014, we had a record wildfire year. In 2015, we broke that record. I think people were, what are all the tools in the toolbox? How do we protect ourselves? How do we make our forests more healthy?
In 2017, the state of Washington made prescribed burns central to its 20-year fire management plan.
We obviously are inheriting a problem that's been over 50 years in the making. It's going to take us a while to get on top of it, but we are going to make a significant difference in restoring the health of our forests, and it will include prescribed fire.
Which brings us full circle, working with fire instead of suppressing it, a practice that's still alive in many tribal cultures today.
What we're really looking at is a group of people that have been able to survive for thousands of years based on their relationship, interaction, and management with resources. I don't feel like you're going to have a very efficient project in today's world ignoring a thousands-year-old data set.
Okay. Could you see that film? Did it show well, Joan?
Yes, I thought it did.
Oh, okay, good. Because sometimes it's like jumpy and it's not smooth. So, okay, good. I'm glad it was, at least you saw it. Some people saw it. Good. Okay, so that's an example of when we talk about indigenous knowledge, about it being applied knowledge in very, substantial and scientific ways. So that leads to the conversation about understanding environmental justice as a colonial imposition or the result of settler colonialism. Then the next conversation is like, how do we decolonize environmental justice from that indigenous lens? And ultimately, I argue that environmental justice, the definition of it in law and policy, needs to be much broader. It needs to include the recognition of U.S. history and the ongoing structure of the U.S. as an ongoing structure of colonialism. So that has to be acknowledged within the activist world, within theory, law, and policy. So that's a tall order, obviously. It needs to recognize indigenous people's different relationship to the land. Indigenous peoples arguably have a much different relationship to land than settler populations do. because of their ancient tenure and different worldviews that create a relationship to land that is beyond, this transactional capitalistic way that the US is founded on private property. And then the UN Declaration of the Indigenous Rights of Indigenous Peoples enshrined the right to free, prior, and informed consent, which is really different than consultation. Federal law mandates consultation, but it doesn't really define what meaningful consultation is. And in fact, Standing Rock happened was because there was no, and it was recognized legally that there was not meaningful consultation. But even if there was, it still doesn't, there still wouldn't have been really any recourse for Standing Rock to oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline from going through their treaty, their unceded treaty lands. So that's why there's an important distinction between consultation and consent. And it's a very fraught concept because the US doesn't like to be, have that kind of veto power invested in tribal nations. And then the final thing to decolonize environmental justice is the recognition of indigenous knowledge systems. Like we're starting to see, as that video that I just showed you kind of highlights, the way Western science in land management around climate change and other environmental issues is finally starting to recognize the importance of indigenous knowledge and indigenous land management practices. Okay, and finally, I'm working on a new book project, and in this project, I'm looking at what it means, what settler privilege means, and settler this concept of understanding privilege beyond a racial lens through understanding what a land ethic is. And this, for those of you who are environmentalists and are familiar with Aldo Leopold, he's most famous for coining this or for writing this essay called The Land Ethic. And so much of environmentalism is based on the work and the philosophies of Aldo Leopold and his land ethic, views, in which he, imbues. He thinks in terms of communities, of the plant communities as, communities that humans need to be in relationship to. So it was really transformational in his time when he was writing about it. And I compare Leopold to N. Scott Momaday, who was the famous Pulitzer Prize winning Kiowa writer that most of you may have heard of, who also wrote about a land ethic. But he wrote about it from his indigenous, Kiowa worldview, and contrast these two and how different they come from, very different frameworks. But my critique of both of these ideas of land ethics is that they are not, neither of them really address the settler society and settler history of violent land theft and genocide. And so for me, it needs to transform that in order to make a fuller conversation that's responsive to Native people around environmental justice. Then we have to understand, we have to bring together the relationship, a human natural world relationship together with the concept of justice between human communities in order for it to be really responsive to Native people. So, so that's where I'm going with the work. I'm hoping it's a book. I'm under contract with Beacon Press. It'll be a while before it's out, but this is sort of the continuation of my last book on environmental justice by, looking at, if we're really going to try to build a world that's sustainable for human habitation, then we need to transform the way that we all live on the planet together, and we have to be responsive to each other as humans, not just to the world. Okay, so I'm going to end there. That's my last slide, and I'm going to stop the screen share, and we can open the conversation up to questions. And conversation.